Number 1. My story is a reminder to you that people online aren't all who they claim to be. It starts about 4 months ago, mid-February. I'm 22, Christian, living with my parents, almost done with my sophomore year of college, single as can be, and there was no sign of that changing anytime soon, seeing as all the single guys in college were just people who wanted nothing but a one-night stand. Some of my friends told me I should try an online dating service, but I was a bit iffy, because I felt it would be hard keeping something with distance, plus I have trust issues when it comes to guys. So, not long after that, I saw an ad for christianmingle.com. And at first, I thought that was stupid, that they were the only way to find your soulmate. But I thought about what my friends told me about online dating, and I thought I'd give it a shot. I decided on that Christian Mingle thing because I figured that there would be less guys there just looking for sex as opposed to the other websites. So, I set up a profile. And of course, I exaggerated a few things, but not too much. I set it up and waited for something to happen. After about 2 weeks, I got a few messages, mostly spam, but a couple hopefuls that I ended up giving up on after they asked me for special pictures. But then I got a message from a guy named Mark, and he seemed like a really nice guy. Plus, he didn't seem to exaggerate every single detail of his profile. He was 24, was apparently a carpenter. He lived in an outskirt of Houston, and I lived in Dallas, so we weren't too far away. And I decided I might give him a shot. We talked a lot over the next few weeks, and he just kept getting better and better. All of our interests were alike, with the exception that he liked country music, and I couldn't stand it. I thought we could make that work. He seemed genuinely interested in me and in something long-term, and that made me really hopeful that we can make things work out between us. About the middle of April, we decided to make things real and get serious about this. We wanted to meet in person. And so we decided that we would come to Dallas and spend a weekend together so he could meet my parents, and hopefully they would approve. So, the next Saturday morning, he drove to Dallas and we finally met at my parents' house. I was a nervous wreck the entire time. It's such a rush seeing the person you're so close to for the first time and realizing that they're actually real. We spent the day together doing typical date stuff. We went out on some fancy place for lunch, caught a movie after that. Then we went home and spent the evening with my parents. We sat down for dinner, and they did their usual interrogation of anyone I get close to, but a little more intense because of the fact we met online. He seemed to be okay with it, and it was like he knew exactly what to say to make my parents happy. After they were satisfied, they gave us their blessing to carry on. Dinner ended about 8, and Mark wanted to get home before it got any darker, so we didn't have to deal with night traffic. We all told him goodnight and wished him a good trip home. And then he took my hand and kissed it. I just melted inside. My parents thought it was a bit odd because nobody really did that anymore, especially in the heart of Texas, but I didn't even care at this point. I was the happiest I'd been in a long time because my parents loved the guy almost as much as I did. We kept talking over time with a newfound fire inside of us since we met, and I was convinced he was the one for me. In the middle of all this, I started getting sick, and I wasn't sure why. I discovered a small rash on my hand, and it just got bigger over time. Last week, it started itching really bad, so I decided to just go to the doctor and ask what it was. He came back and asked if I'd been to any other countries later, or been in contact with any wild animals, and I told him I hadn't. The doctor told me I had an illness from the rash, and he said it spread by contact with animals that have eaten human flesh. I told him that just wasn't possible. Nothing had happened with animals. I'm allergic to dogs and cats, so we never had pets, and the only thing that came close to that was when Mark kissed my hand. Then I froze, and I realized what it all meant. I told the doctor my story, and he told me I should give the police his name, just to check and make sure. He gave me a prescription to help get rid of the rash, and I called the Houston police and told them what I thought, and they said they'd check him out. The next night, I saw on the news that there was a police raid on a house in Houston. They had found human remains inside, with evidence that he had been eating them. All the remains belonged to 3 missing girls from the area who had been talking to him on various dating websites. The news showed a picture of Mark, and it disgusted me to see his face on that screen. It made me sick to my stomach knowing that I was almost his next meal. And they said 3 words that chilled me to the bone. Still at large. He knows where I live. Number 2.
When I was 16, I got my first job working part-time in retail. I worked in a store that sells bedding and houseware items, so the majority of the other employees are much older than me. Everyone was really cool, but there was one guy who was kind of creepy. He was 47, and by the time this story happens, I was 17. He was hired as one of the department managers. At first, he seemed pretty normal, but then he started making some inappropriate comments, most of them about how pretty I was and how I was way out of his league. He would say disparaging things about himself and follow it up with how great I was. One day I came to work wearing glasses and a ponytail. It was after closing and we were cleaning up, getting ready to leave. Just he and I were in the stockroom. He looked at me and said that I reminded him of the sexy librarian who is all prim and proper at work, but when she leaves, she takes off her glasses, pulls her hair down and flips it around. You know, like you see in one of those slow-motion fantasy sequences. I was a very shy teenager and didn't really know what to say to that. I was officially creeped out, so I made up some excuse and got the hell out of there. Even though I was creeped out by him, I was a very trusting and naive teenager, so I never said anything to anyone about it. A few months later, it was dance recital time. I had a tape of it back in the 90s before DVDs were so common, and a friend at the store borrowed it because she wanted to watch my dances. She brings it back, and somehow it got into the hands of the creeper. He took it home and watched it. The next shift I worked, he gave me back the tape and told me that he left something in my locker. On my break, I went and read it. He had watched the video and figured out which numbers I was in, which is probably 5 dances out of about 60. He then detailed what he liked about each dance. I wish I still had that letter, but I lost it at some point. The way he wrote it made it sound like I'd slept with him. It was also typed, and instead of signing his name, he wrote me. I don't know if that's because he knew it was inappropriate and wanted a way to deny that he wrote it or what. Either way, I freaked out. I didn't know what to do. I avoided him the rest of the shift. Luckily, I got off at an earlier time from him, so I wasn't worried about him following me or anything. There was one manager at work whom I trusted, so the next time I worked, I went to his office and showed him the letter. I was close to tears in his office and told them that I was leaving and I had already had another job offer. He stopped me and said they would take care of it and asked if I would consider staying. I asked what he meant, and he just said he would take care of it. The rest of my shift, he watched out and made sure Creeper Guy was nowhere near me. The next day, when I wasn't working, they, the managers, had a meeting with him and confronted him about the letter. He confirmed that he wrote it and he was fired. They escorted him out of the building. When I came back, they had given me a raise. I was relieved, but at the same time I felt guilty. I kept thinking that I got this guy fired. I was also scared he would retaliate in some way. When we closed, we didn't get off work until midnight sometimes, but my manager would always walk me to my car to make sure I was safe when I was leaving. I never heard from the guy again. I don't even remember his last name. I'm so glad Facebook wasn't around at this time because I could see him stalking me that way. I'm also glad that I was smart enough to speak up, as this was one of the hardest things I had had to do at that point in my life.
Number 3. A year ago, I went to visit an old friend of mine from college named Chris. He lives in Connecticut with his wife Susan and their son Todd. The plan was for us to hang out for a few days, so they had promised to prepare a guest room for me. When I arrived, Chris took me aside. "I know we promised you the guest room," he said quietly, "but something's come up. Susan's Uncle John just got divorced and she offered him a place to stay until he can find an apartment. He won't be in our way, but I had to let him have the guest room." "No problem," I said. "Where am I sleeping then?" "It's going to sound creepy, but I've got you set up in the attic. There's a small room up there which we were planning to turn into a playroom for when Todd's older. It's got a futon that turns into a bed. You just have to watch your step coming down the stairs at night if you do that." I shrugged. "That sounds fine with me." That night I woke up to the sounds of the house settling. There was a creaking coming from just outside my bedroom door, like someone pacing slowly back and forth. I lay there with my blankets pulled up to my chin, staring out into the darkness of the attic and feeling very vulnerable. The only way out was through that door and down the stairs. As is often the case when one wakes up in the middle of the night, I felt a sudden urge to use the bathroom. I tried holding it in for what seemed like an hour, but eventually my fear of that strange creaking noise was overpowered by my bladder's need to empty itself. I wish I'd brought a flashlight, I mumbled to myself, stepping carefully to the door. I put my ear to the wood to listen to that creaking sound, but as I approached the door, it stopped. I halted a moment, my ears prickling, trying to hear the slightest sound above the silence that had suddenly enveloped me. Finally, desperately needing to pee, I stepped back and opened the door. Nothing. Feeling foolish, I crept along the attic to where the stairs were, trying to make sure not to fall down them. I made it down the stairs, found my way to the bathroom thanks to a nightlight, then headed back up the stairs to the attic. As I got up into the darkened landing, I realized the creaking sound had returned. With it, I could hear some sort of swishing sound, like someone dragging their feet, and muffling sort of sobbing. I held my breath, frightened but not wanting to show it, in case it was just Chris playing a prank on me. "Hello?" I said in my bravest voice. The shuffling and sobbing stopped. "Who is that?" Came back a very quiet voice. "It's Will. Who is that? That's who's thatting?" "Oh, you're Chris's friend." Someone moved forward. I couldn't quite see him in the dark, but I could make out a white shirt covered with dark stains and striped pajama pants. "I'm John, Susan's uncle. I'm sorry if I woke you." "You didn't," I lied. "I just had to use the bathroom." "Why are you up here?" he asked. "They've set me up in the attic room." He sniffed. "Oh, I see. I'm in the way again." No. I wasn't sure if he meant he was in the way at the moment, or in the way claiming the guest room, but it didn't really matter. Really, I just wanted to go back to bed. I felt a strange sense of unease and dread standing there in the dark with this vague form of a man. "I'm sorry, I thought this would be a good place to contemplate things," he said. "It's fine," I lied again. "I'm just heading back to bed. Sorry to have interrupted you." And with that said, I crept past him, praying that he wasn't so completely out of sorts that he couldn't tell when someone was just being polite. If he stays up there doing that sobbing and pacing all night, I'll never get any sleep, I thought. And I was right. As soon as I closed the door, Uncle John started up his pacing again. From inside the room, all I could hear was the switching of his slippered feet on the floor and the creak of the floorboards. 3 nights of this. Every night. I'd wake up and it'd be pitch dark, and I'd hear floorboards creaking and Uncle John shuffling back and forth. Sometimes he'd break out sobbing again, and I'd have to cover my head with a pillow just to try to muffle him out. I barely saw him during the day. He never ate with us, never sat around the house. He just hid in the guest room and then shuffled past to go out to his car and drive away without even a hello. By the 3rd morning, I was exhausted. Chris and Susan noticed. "Are you sleeping okay?" Chris asked me as I dangled my chin over a bowl of cereal. I have to be honest, I'm not. I looked up at him from the dark circles under my eyes. Uncle John comes up to the attic every night and paces back and forth and cries. I ran into him first night, and I didn't say anything, but honestly, he keeps waking me up and keeping me up for hours with it. "I'm so sorry," Susan said, her face turning red. "He's been really depressed lately, as you can imagine. I'll talk to him about it." "I don't want to upset him or cause a problem. He's staying with you for who knows how long, and I'm just here for a couple more days." When Susan left the kitchen, Chris grumbled, "I'd rather have you here than him. I hope he's not staying who knows how long. That guy gives me the creeps." I understood him completely. There was something unsettling about Uncle John. I didn't want to say it out loud, but I nodded at Chris, and he nodded back at me and then rolled his eyes. That evening, as we were all saying our goodnights, Susan approached me. "I talked to my uncle this afternoon. He said he won't be bothering you anymore." "Did he say it like that?" I asked, feeling slightly guilty. "Yeah, basically. You have to understand, my uncle really loved my aunt. He's devastated by this divorce." I shouldn't ask, but... I paused, making sure we weren't being listened in on. "Do you know what led to it?" "The divorce? No, they always seemed happy together," Susan whispered. She seemed to dwell on something for a moment. "Uncle John was in Vietnam, and he suffered from PTSD for years. Aunt Ellie told me once that he used to wake up in the middle of the night crying because of it, but he'd been getting better. She said as his worse, he mistook her for someone trying to kill him one night when he woke up. Almost strangled her. Maybe it just got to be too much for her to deal with." "Aren't you worried he might attack you or Chris or Todd?" I whispered. "Not really. He keeps to himself in his room almost all the time, as you've seen. He's embarrassed and doesn't want to be here. He's got nowhere else to go now. He's got too much pride to leech off our goodwill for too long." At that point, we said goodnight, and I went to bed wishing I hadn't asked any of the questions or complained to begin with. I woke up a few hours later when something loud fell over. "What the F?" I yelled, sitting bolt upright in my bed. Creak, 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 outside my door. "You have to be kidding me," I mumbled to myself. I
pulled the blanket over my head, but it was no good. I was awake, and now I needed to pee. I climbed out of bed and trudged across the dark room. Creak, creak, creak. "Uncle John, I'm just passing through to the bathroom," I said in a loud whisper as I opened the door. I felt around in the dark attic, not wanting to bump into him. Creak, creak, creak in the dark. He was somewhere to my left. I remembered seeing lots of packed boxes over there during the day. He must have knocked something over during his pacing. I figured that was the best he could do for not bothering me again. As I descended the stairs, I heard him sobbing quietly behind me. I had to stick my fist in my mouth to stifle a groan. When I came back up a few minutes later, he had stopped pacing, but there was a strange thumping every couple seconds, like he was sitting there punching a box. Yeah, that's normal, I thought. Just a grown man sitting in a dark attic punching a box and sobbing to himself. I crawled back into bed and lay there, staring up into the dark ceiling rafters, listening to the quiet thumping outside my room. He stopped making the sound a few minutes later, and I fell back asleep. I woke up to screaming. It was Susan. All I could think was, Uncle John has flipped his lid and is killing him. I leapt to my feet, stumbling over my suitcase, and tore out of the room to help. It was a casual thing, glancing to the left as I ran out of the room. Kind of, I wonder what it was Uncle John knocked over last night glance. The answer was a chair. Uncle John had knocked over a chair in the dark. And honestly, it made sense to knock over the chair, because how else was he going to hang himself from the rafters without finding a chair to stand on and then kicking the chair out? That's what he had done. Uncle John was hanging there, right in front of me. An orange extension cord taut around his neck. His face was swollen and purple, and his tongue was sticking out of his mouth like he was making an expression of pure disgust. His eyes were bulging out of their sockets, staring blankly into space. I stopped my mad dash for the stairs and forgot all about the screaming for a minute. I stood there, staring at John's corpse, reliving those moments in the darkness when I thought I heard the creak of floorboards as he paced. It was the sound of the cord shifting against the wooden beam with each swing of his body. The thumping must have been his feet bumping into nearby boxes. The screaming continued downstairs, and it took me a moment to realize they couldn't possibly be screaming for the same reason I wanted to scream. I descended the stairs slowly, watching John disappear from my view as I went. I don't know why, but I had come to the irrational idea that if I turned my back, he'd come down from the rafter and grab me, maybe stick me up in his place. When I got downstairs, Susan was in hysterics. Chris was alternating between trying to talk to someone on the phone and yelling at her. "Just take Todd and go," he was shouting, occasionally accentuating the point by shaking her like a rag doll. When he saw me, he let go of Susan and hurried over. "132 Burgess Lane," he yelled at the phone. "I don't know, send anybody. I don't think paramedics will be effective, though." "Uncle John," I stammered. Chris stuffed the phone back in the pocket of his bathrobe. "Yeah," he said, gripping my shoulders. We stared at each other. Chris looked determined and focused. I'm sure I looked horrified and pale. "I need you to help me. Take Susan and Todd and get them out of here. I can't have Todd seeing this." I nodded dumbly and walked past Chris, taking Susan by the arm. I guided her crying downstairs, then went back up and got Todd, who was sitting in his bed looking confused and worried. I bundled us all up, and with Todd in my arms, I led Susan to my car. She sat there in the passenger seat, gasping for breath as I buckled Todd in the back. I could hear sirens in the distance getting closer. I climbed into the car and looked at Susan. "Susan, I'm so sorry." She looked at me through tear-filled eyes. "There was so much blood," she whispered. "What?" "I've never seen so much blood." "Wait right here," I told them both as I unbuckled myself and got out of the car. I ran back inside and took the stairs 3 steps at a time to the second floor. Chris was slumped against the frame of the door to the guest room, looking in. I went up to him and looked into the room. There was a body in the bed, curled on its side in a ruined nightgown. Arms and legs stretched out like it was welcoming a hug. The head was on the dresser across the room. It was an elderly woman. Her hair was long and silver, her eyes dark and empty. Her mouth hung open slightly. The sheets and pillows were brown with days-old dried blood, and otherwise green carpeting was brown around the bed and dresser. "Aunt Ellie," Chris looked up at me. "That fucking psycho killed her and brought her into my house. God knows when. He cut her head off. He cut her fucking head off. When they find him..." "Well, they won't have to look very far," I said. The image of that room of death burned into my brain. "He's up in the attic." Chris stiffened. "He hanged himself." I held his shoulder and he squeezed my hand. We stayed the next night in a hotel. Chris needed help calming Susan down while taking care of Todd. She was in severe shock.
I took Todd out to a movie so Chris and Susan could be alone for a few hours. We had told Todd that his mommy had found an infestation of ants and the house had to be fumigated. Uncle John had found a new place to live. Terrible, terrible lies, but he was only 6 and believed every word. I left for home 2 days later. They spent another week and a half in the hotel while police documented everything and the cleaners came and tidied up. Chris told me Susan insisted on throwing out all the furniture in the guest room. She redecorated it to look completely different. She never wanted to see it the way it had been again. I've been back to their house only once since then. Chris gave me a sideways glance when I requested the attic room over the guest room. Susan developed a bit of a nervous twitch at the request but said nothing. I only spent the one night. Hours after everyone else was asleep, when the world seemed distant, I woke up with a chill over my skin. I was covered head to toe in blankets, but there was a distinct frigid cold that seemed to settle over me. I lay there, looking up into the infinite shadows, and I swear I heard sobbing outside my door. Hey guys, it's Dawn. Want more? Hit that red subscribe button and follow the links in the description to follow us on Twitter and Google+. Also, if you have any scary stories, creepy artwork, or disturbing pictures you'd like to see featured in one of our videos, send them to the email address below. We'd love to hear from you guys. Thanks for watching, and until next time.